In today's episode, we're talking about the war of priority when it comes to fisheries management. Sport fish versus native fish. Where's the line? Which way should it go? What affects it? What factors contribute to this war? It is something that's very important, something that needs to be considered. And with me today, I have Mitch from the San Antonio River Authority to help us dive into this and learn more about it. And I promise you, there's going to be some things that you didn't understand or didn't know that actually affects this as well. Something's crazy simple. I promise you're going to get something out of this episode, so stay tuned.
Welcome to the Bait Tank, where if it's fishing, we'll talk about it. Whether it's gear, techniques, stories, or the health of our waterways, nothing's off the hook. So grab your rod, sit back, and let's dive in.
Hey, y'all, welcome back to the Bait Tank. My name is Anthony, and with me today is San Antonio River Authority aquatic biologist Mitch. Mitch, welcome in, man. How you doing today?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. So we were talking about when it comes to fisheries management, there seems to be a priority sometimes between sport fish and native fish. So do you kind of want to maybe first start off with your background and then maybe try to maybe offer your opinion on it, and then we can kind of discuss deeper how that goes and what we can maybe do to adjust it in the future?
Sure. Sounds good. Yeah. So, like Anthony said, aquatic biologist right now in San Antonio. It's been I'd say a long road kind of to get here or to put me in this spot. I'm actually from San Antonio, but I made a big kind of lap during my kind of career path going out west to states like Utah and Wyoming, and did my master's out of Nebraska, where I did a lot of field work and research in South Dakota, and then did like I said, a lap and ended up back here. But yeah, my background, I've worked in both fisheries management, focusing on, the angler or the recreational aspect of things, but also have worked on native fish conservation, endangered species monitoring, and that kind of thing. So I've seen kind of both worlds of that during my time. And it's interesting, I think, both sides and depending on who you talk to, they may have stronger opinions, but, seeing that the value in both sides of these things, and they all kind of play a role in a larger fisheries world, whether you're just like to go out and throw a line out, or, you're actually involved in management or conservation. So kind of cool to get those perspectives, and I can dive a little bit more into that.
Good thing. And like you said, you did make a lap. You mean you covered 2/3 of the country in your training and experience, all the way from out west to southern Midwest up to North Dakota. So furthest north point you can go, or one of the most northern points you can go.
Yeah.
Back. That's pretty cool. Now, you said you're an aquatic biologist, so you do more than just fish. You want to kind of go into that a little more?
Sure. Yeah. So in my current role, we're looking at the overall holistic health of the river, or the streams and creeks that run in our basin here. So we cover, our jurisdiction's 4 counties, but we work in a couple other counties at the upper end of our basin too. But we are looking at fish. We're also surveying and monitoring freshwater mussels, and also sampling benthic macroinvertebrates, which is a fancy word for water bugs, right? Lots of bugs start out, as many anglers know, start out in the water before they emerge and become a dragonfly or damselfly, or whatever the case. And they can tell you a lot about water quality. And that's a large aspect of my job as well, is monitoring water quality, getting routine water quality samples. We have a nationally accredited lab that will process all of the water, and all of this kind of works under the Texas Clean Rivers program through our Commission of Environmental Quality. And so it's a large statewide program that we operate under, that we're kind of monitoring our rivers and streams, whether that again is for water quality, fish, bugs, and then we do a lot of mussel work on top of that. And we got a lot of cool projects, and I also have we have a lake that's going to be opening up to the public that we're working with the local Texas Parks and Wildlife Agency here to kind of manage. That'll be more, recreationally angling focused. So we kind of get to touch a lot of different things, which is really neat, and do it in a cool place. So that's.
Now, for those who aren't geographically savvy, where in Texas exactly is the San Antonio River?
Yeah, so San Antonio River. San Antonio is kind of the south central portion of the state. It's I can't remember what, I think it's like the 4th largest city in the United States, which is kind of nuts. But the river itself runs from the city of San Antonio, flows southeast towards the basically the Gulf of Mexico. Right before it hits the Gulf, it confluences with another river, the Guadalupe River, and then kind of goes into our bay system that's kind of protected from the Gulf from a lot of our barrier islands. So obviously a lot of what we do here is going to influence our bays and estuaries and everything downstream. So
that's one thing people don't really ever think about, I guess, is if you're at the top of the river system, you affect everybody downstream.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's pretty crazy to think about how much you yourself being in that position are able to influence, which is really cool. With that being said, on your travels to North Dakota and Nebraska and Utah and whatnot, what was maybe maybe your favorite project you worked on or favorite study you did maybe?
Yeah, so I did a lot of cool and different stuff. The one that's probably the most significant to me is my graduate work. Again, was doing a lot of work up in South Dakota. I know you said North Dakota. It was mainly South.
I'm sorry.
Some in North. No problem. But that was actually the project was focused on, getting a status and distribution abundance of two candidate ESA species, the sturgeon chub and the sicklefin chub. So little bitty minnow.
Okay.
But that was a really cool project just because I got to lead it and got to kind of from start to finish go through that kind of process of doing some research and got to see a lot of cool areas. It was mainly in the Missouri River and then a handful of its western tributaries in the state. So did a lot of camping and traveling and going to remote areas. Some of our sites are in the Badlands of South Dakota and near the Black Hills on one of the tribs. And so really cool geographically mixed with, some research that I got to hit the ground running with to kind of build my skills and experience in the field.
Awesome. Now you said Canada ESA. What does that exactly mean?
Yeah. So it's a candidate endangered species, basically.
Oh, okay. Got you.
Yeah. Right. So they were proposed to be listed and they were in basically like a review period. So they were trying to gather data and information of them kind of all over the U.S. and they're native to the Missouri drainage, so, all the way up to where it starts in Montana, all the way down to where it hits the Mississippi. I
was not aware it reached that far over. I didn't realize it was in Montana.
Yeah.
That's nuts.
That's headwater.
So you dealt with a lot of big systems then, really.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. So you said it was the sturgeon chub and the what chub?
The sicklefin chub.
Sicklefin chub. I've obviously never heard of either one of those, but it sounds pretty cool.
Yeah.
What, I guess at this point, since you did that study, that was during your graduate period, I'm assuming it's been a few years since then. What ended up being the vote on that review? Did they end up getting put in that list? Or?
They actually did not get listed. So, yeah, just enough data to kind of say that their populations, that the populations they did have were relatively stable. But they're kind of a complex species. They're small, but they're short-lived. They are highly impacted by fragmentation and drought. So they belong to their genus is called Macrobopsis. They're pretty cool, but they are essentially broadcast spawning minnows. So they actually spawn like pelagic or ocean fish, where they'll just release their eggs. They'll drift for really long distances while they develop into larval stages, and they'll keep drifting, and eventually they're free swimming. But they need there's been some studies done, and they need over 200 kilometers of free flowing river to be able to kind of actually reproduce and have just to be able to recruit. So it's that is a limited.
200 kilometers is a lot of water.
Yeah, it's a limited commodity when we got all the dams that we do. So it's a tricky one. And then obviously if drought happens and areas go dry, that's going to impact them with that fragmentation. So it kind of just slowly has taken hits on them. And it's kind of interesting. They were proposed for listing back in the 90s, but then they started using basically trawling for them before it was all, using seines and shallow water stuff. And especially the sicklefin chub will sit in a lot deeper water than you'd think a small fish would, deep, fast. And so they started trawling, basically just dragging a net on the bottom of the river and going however deep they needed to go and started catching more fish and saw they were more prolific than they thought. And then, fast forward 20 years, somebody proposed their listing again and kind of went through that process. But Yeah, so they're really interesting fish. It's cool that, we actually have a Macrobopsis species, so the same genus in the San Antonio River that I get to work with now. So they're pretty.
Which one was that one?
That one's the burrhead chub.
Okay.
Yeah, so another chub, a similar life history, and we have one site where we catch a whole bunch of them, so it's cool to see.
Is that also a Canada ESA, or is that just a...
No, it's on the Texas Species of Greatest Conservation Need, which is, a lot of states will have these fish or these animals that they'll put on this list, and they're they're not federally listed, but they're more or less, they could be state endangered or state threatened, or kind of like a state of concern, and that's kind of where they fall on this. So
it makes sense with it being a state level thing that they would have their own list. I suppose just a federal one. I mean, that makes sense. With that being said, you were talking about being, you said, I forgot the word you said, but you were talking about how it's one of the stepping stones. If it wasn't the word you used, but basically the idea was that it was a stepping stone to improve water clarity and health of the river and whatnot. Can you kind of explain to what degree that actually affects the rest of the fishery in your experience?
So how water quality and habitat,
the whole thing. Start from the beginning, ground up. Let's go. Crash course for dummies. Let's go.
Yeah. If you have bad water quality or, good water quality, that's going to impact all the organisms that are living there. So let's see, for instance, in urban areas where you have maybe, you have concreted river channels, you don't have a lot of different kinds of habitat. You might have more runoff in urban areas from like stormwater. We have more pollutants being flushed into the water from these hard surfaces. Can impact water quality, which can then impact up the food chain. It could impact fish directly, or maybe it impacts what they eat. That's a big reason of why we monitor basically the bugs in the water, is because they can be really good indicators of, is water quality good? Is it bad? Is, habitat good or bad? They can give us idea of what that ecosystem health kind of looks like from the bottom end. And then on top of that, if we add fish, and a lot of times those things will kind of correlate. Typically what our monitoring is when we're looking at fish and bugs is, we're looking at a few metrics to kind of gauge what that community looks like. What we use is called the index of biotic integrity, which is basically, like I said, there's a metrics like, percent of native versus non-native fish, or, they'll have different percentage of the different trophic levels, like predators or, herbivores, omnivores, or you'll have, are they a tolerant fish, like, for instance, like a red shiner, that's one that we find kind of all over the place. It's a minnow species, but it's very common, and it can kind of exist in, maybe in not so favorable conditions. So if you have a large percentage of your minnows being in that group, and not a lot of diversity in that group, that functionally, maybe the habitat or the niche kind of isn't there for other fishes that might be a little more specialized. But yeah, so there's all kinds of little metrics that will run with that. And basically we can go sample a site and say, at the end of the day, we'll get a score, right? And part of that is like our effort as well, like, how many seines we did and the distances. And, we're doing also electrofishing. So the time that we spend, sampling for fish is a factor. But at the end of the day, we'll get a score, and it's like, oh, you got a 40, and that'll put it in a bin of, basically fish health is intermediate, high, exceptional, and we can monitor sites, use kind of trends over time, going from sites year to year to see how health is going up or down, and see, try to figure out if there are any contributions to that, and there's anything we can do to make changes or whatever the case may be. But yeah, there's a lot that goes into, assessing an area, and, that's just living on the end stream. If you're thinking about, if you branch out, and again, I kind of mentioned that, but, the riparian area, what the corridor is like, are contaminants hitting lots of vegetation to be, kind of filter out anything coming into the river first, or is it just coming off of hard surfaces? So landscape factors obviously play a role, and, there's all kinds of factors that go into it. So.
Sure. In terms of, obviously you talk about the bugs and the food sources and they trickling up and whatnot, is there like a certain, I don't know, maybe I keep wanting to say the word cornerstone, it may not be the right word, but a certain species of bug that seems to be more detrimental or more beneficial than others? I mean, is there one, it's just absolutely everywhere, and if that ever goes away, we're in trouble kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we do bug stuff when I got some bug knowledge. I'd say I have more with fish. I can tell you the good bug would be like a Dobson fly, or like a Helgramite. I don't know if you ever heard of those. Yeah, they're pretty gnarly looking, and those ones are, they're predators, and so their presence kind of gives you an indicator that things may be going well there, especially if you catch many of them.
I said they hurt too. The Helgramites too.
Yeah, definitely. I've never been hit by one, but I've definitely heard they're pretty nasty looking.
I know several people that have, and I've seen the after effects. So, yeah. But so even at the fish level, is there a certain like shiner or chub or anything like that that's maybe the same concept as like if you add a lot of those is good, and if not, we're wondering why? I mean, like more so than other. I mean, obviously, if you break everything to a certain species, then obviously the concern is that species. But I mean, is there a blanket species that seems to be a huge factor in your percentages or for your scores? I mean,
yeah. So like let me think about that. So species will also get kind of a classification. Again, like I said, like, are they intolerant? Are they tolerant? And that'll basically tell us, like, are things, they're kind of that keystone or that indicator species to look at. So like, for instance, darters are very sensitive species, having many of those. And it depends on where you are. If we're in a spring system, we may expect to catch more, right? And they should be there. And if we don't catch them, that would be a pretty big concern. There's also some cyprinids or some, minnows that tell us a lot about that. A lot of the small fishes tell us kind of a lot about what's happening, whether, habitat's good or bad or water quality, that kind of thing. But, some sport fish and stuff can too. In Texas, the state fish of Texas is the Guadalupe Bass, and it's more of an intolerant fish, and again, needs good habitat and water quality and all that stuff. And so when we catch those, we get excited, and it's an important species recreationally here, but also but it also can tell us about kind of the health of the area. So,
and just to confirm it, the Guadalupe Bass is not a strain of largemouth; it is straight up its own species, correct?
Correct. Yeah, it's right. More closely related to like a spotted bass.
Okay. Yeah. With that being the state fish of Texas, how big do they get? Because not everybody's gonna know that. Because I'm not from Texas, I don't know that much about them.
Yeah, so they won't get as big as a largemouth. A big, I don't know what a record would be, but like a big Guadalupe Bass is 13, 15 inches probably. I'm sure they get larger than that, but I think that'd be kind of rare. They're a really cool story because, and this is, kind of goes into what we wanted to talk about. And we're at a pretty sharp decline because they were dealing with hybridization from introduced smallmouth bass and a lot of the systems that they were in. So this kind of goes back in the day, fisheries managers made a lot of, I guess, questionable decisions when putting fish in and stocking fish in areas. And smallmouth bass was one of those in Texas. And it started hybridizing and actually, kind of taking over Guadalupe bass. And so there's been a really big conservation effort here in the state to raise, pure strain Guadalupe bass and reintroduce them into waterways and kind of manage and make conservation efforts, gear them towards those fish. And the San Antonio is a great example. They actually were reintroduced back in 2017 into what we call the Mission Reach, which is a really large restored area of the San Antonio River below the actual on the south end of the city. And they stocked them. Can't remember what numbers were, maybe close to 200,000 in the first few years, putting in fry. And now we have established, reproducing populations in the Mission Reach and beyond that. We're finding them in a lot of our tributaries, finding them way downstream where you wouldn't expect to see them. So cool to see them kind of take a stronghold. And that's kind of the story in a lot of other places as well with these efforts that have been kind of done. So,
and they were actually native, correct?
Yeah. So they're
start with, okay.
Native to the state. Yeah,
I got you. That's cool. So obviously you said you reintroduced them. Does that mean reintroduced? Yeah, reintroduced. Does that mean they were considered extinct in that section of the river at that point?
Yeah.
For the reintroduced word? Okay.
Mm-hmm. So in the San Antonio, they were non-existent there. Yeah.
That's cool. That's mission success then, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
So obviously the further north you go, obviously it depends. We have hatcheries here in Tennessee for trout specifically because they stock the Tellico and the Gallenberg, Smoky Mountains area, all that stuff. And I think they send some of their fry to other places around here too. I'm not 100% on that. And I know the further north you go, it depends on the local fish politics, I guess, to figure out which species are going where. I actually spoke with a guy in Canada who's dealt with 4 different strains of rainbow trout, and then his one invasive species they mess with is brook trout. So that was kind of weird. But so are most of the hatcheries in Texas, are most of them Guadalupe bass, or is it kind of I mean, it's a big state, so I'm assuming there's a little bit of variety, but like how much of it, I guess, is focused on that fish?
Yeah, I would say a smaller amount compared to raising something like a largemouth bass, right? Texas has got a large recreational freshwater fishing industry. We have some really big and popular lakes to go out and chase big trophy bass. So that's definitely a big priority, I would say, in the state, and raising stuff like largemouth for those kind of large reservoirs, those trophy kind of fisheries. And I wish I was on, I don't want to botch this, but the Texas Freshwater Fisheries Center up in Athens has a kind of a share lunker program where, they'll take in angler caught broodstock and raise up some nice fish and release them, and then eventually release the broodstock back in. And they have a big share lunker kind of program. And you may have more knowledge on programs like that than I do. I'm actually,
I don't know. It sounds cool though. Yeah, I don't personally know. I mean,
yeah, I'm
getting the public involved.
I did a lot of coastal fishing. So I did a lot of stuff out on the bays. Done some freshwater, mainly in rivers and stuff. So the actual trophy bass lane is not something I've been in myself, but I think it's a really cool opportunity for folks. And I know it's important because that speaks to a lot of the economic value of fisheries and all that.
For sure. So, yeah. Speaking of that, there's a lot of influence dollars wise when it comes to the recreational angling, for sure, especially for certain species, largemouth bass being one, like you mentioned. I know Justin had mentioned in Florida for his group of people, mostly it was tarpon, that they brought in like hundreds of millions of dollars a year or something. Yeah. It was like, wow, okay.
Yeah.
As for the whole priority shift, obviously we're talking about the successful mission you had that Texas has had with the Guadalupe bass. Obviously, at one point they were extinct. Do you think that was from being, maybe, I don't know if this is the right word, due to a larger priority on recreational fishing, or do you think it was more of due to a lack of studying the native species at the time and it kind of just got forgotten?
Yeah, probably a mix of both. Yeah, I don't know how far back the history of their kind of taxonomy and when they were necessarily discovered, but if they weren't at that point, and and folks knew that smallmouth bass were maybe just the knowledge base wasn't there, right? And they didn't know that they would have these levels of impacts. And I think it was, trying to provide, I'm sure, more recreational fishing opportunities. And it was kind of a common practice that you see throughout a lot of the United States. And this is by far there's much worse circumstances where, there's been a targeted approach to, we're going to remove these native fish, in very, very large quantities to put in more recreational targeted species, ones that they were designated as game fish, or whether they were native or non-native. It was, we want more fishing, so we need to take out these fish that people don't like to go for. Maybe they're harder to catch, or they're harder to clean and cook and that kind of thing, and so let's put in trout, let's put in bass. And there's a lot of that throughout kind of history, I guess.
Sure. Is there one in particular for Texas that you could think of that went through that scenario?
I can't speak a lot of that on Texas. My kind of more knowledge base into that is working up in the upper Colorado River system in Utah and in Wyoming. There's so in Utah where I worked for the DNR, and we monitored endangered species. There were suckers and some chubs and some really, really unique endemic native fish, like the razorback sucker, the Colorado pike minnow, the round-tailed chub. All these fish are very, very endemic to the upper Colorado River system, that kind of desert stream system. A lot of those fishes are, present throughout like the Grand Canyon, and so they're very characteristic to that region. Way back in the day, they were, again, large efforts to go in and rotenone, which is basically putting a chemical in the water it attacks fish's gills and basically kills everything that's in the system. So they'll go in and rotenone these large sections of river, to then come in and put in trout or put in bass or whatever the case was.
That's crazy, man.
It's really crazy to think about now, but like back in the day, that was very, very common practice. It was, we want to establish a trout fishery. Let's get rid of these, trash fish, for a lack of a better term. And unfortunately, that was the case for a lot of areas. And it takes a hit on some of these fish, which a lot of times are are very long lived. So they have life history strategies that, this doesn't bode well for them. Right. So yeah, so kind of a tricky thing.
Sure. And do you think that in your experience that is it shifting more towards protected native fish? Or is it kind of more 50-50 at this point? Maybe, at least, let me rephrase. Let's just say the native fish is the positive direction. Is it shifting in a positive direction?
Yeah, it's absolutely going in a positive direction. I mean, those kinds of practices you just wouldn't see nowadays. And it's been that way I'd say for a while. So yeah, there's definitely more, I guess, awareness. A good example is like gar, maybe 20 plus years ago. And I'm sure some people still hold some of these opinions, right? But 20 plus years ago, the gar were one of those kind of trash fish, or one of those rough fish, right? Is what they'll call them. And
they still are here in Tennessee.
Yeah.
And nobody likes them.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it was, you catch a gar, throw it up on the bank, and it's unfortunate, but again, I don't know what that stems from. If it just thinks, they're eating all the bass, or, whatever the case is, I don't know.
Yeah.
A lot of times, there's been more of a turnaround on them as far as people maybe having a different value for them, whether that's eating or whether that's, I want to have big gar in the system so that I can catch really, really big gar and take a cool photo, and all that kind of stuff. So, it's interesting to see kind of people kind of change tunes over time, and we're definitely, I think, trending in a positive way, and that's just, I think, one example of that. So
sure. I've often wondered if maybe for the gar scenario, because obviously they tend to be in shallower water overall, I wonder if maybe the people that used to bank fish all the time, all of a sudden their favorite spot was just gar and they couldn't catch any bass. Maybe that's where that trash thing came from. Like, these are in my way, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know for sure. But like, I know in Tennessee specifically, we have alligator gar. I know that's the big difference between here and Texas. They have huge alligator gar. They have bigger long nose gar. They have all the other. I think you guys have short nose, long nose, alligator. I know there's crocodile, which is the crossbreed between alligator and the long nose. Do you guys have any like the spotted or any other ones like that, or is it just?
Yep. So we have spotted in Texas. We have spotted, long nose, short nose, and alligator gar.
That's awesome. But like I said, it's a endangered species here in Tennessee. I've caught one alligator gar. It was only about 2 feet long.
Wow.
Yeah, and I caught it while I was catfishing on accident, but it was cool. It was just like, oh, cool! I've caught a fish that most people have never seen here ever, in person. So it was so little. I couldn't. It was hard to brag about because it was so small. And if I'd have known about it at the time, I was under the impression at that point in time in my fishing career, if you will, that in order to claim a state record, you had to kill the fish. So I didn't think anything about it. I just let it go because I'm not really about that. It turns out that there would have been a state record fish because nobody's claimed one. Oh, so wow. that was my I should have had a record story.
Yeah.
And then, but yeah, no, it's cool seeing this. I mean, like, I know in terms of reintroducing species, the big one they're doing here in Tennessee or one of the big ones, I should say. There's multiple, but the biggest one from a recreational fishing standpoint is the lake sturgeon.
Oh yeah.
They've been working on it for 25 years now, I think. So they're just now in the last year or so getting the population is actually starting to breed, because I guess they have to be 23 and a half years old to breed or something like that. And so they're really, finally starting to
really long-lived fish. So that's awesome, though. It's really cool.
Yeah. It's cool seeing that. It's cool seeing those success stories, and then obviously we have a small striper fishery up north of here. It's the Watts Bar. It's on the Tennessee River, but it's Watts Bar Lake. That section from Watts Bar Dam below is one of the to my knowledge, one of the only places that they can naturally reproduce, because of the same thing you talk about with the chub species. They have so many miles of water in order to actually breed. So it's cool seeing those success stories and being around it and being able to ask questions and see stuff. But in that term of projects and whatnot, I know you said your favorite project was the one up in South Dakota with the 2 chubs.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a project that you're currently working on that you can? I mean, I don't know if you're allowed to talk about this or not. Obviously, I don't want to get you in trouble with work or anything. But is there any project you're currently working on that you think is kind of cool or different?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably the biggest one is we're working to reintroduce freshwater mussels into the San Antonio River, the upper San Antonio River. So I mentioned before the Mission Reach. That's a large restored part of the river. San Antonio, if you haven't been or aren't familiar, the downtown area, the Riverwalk, is kind of the world-renowned location. And it's very much, it has concreted banks and, there's a series of floodgates and all kinds of things that go into what that area looks like. And obviously those things will degrade a river, will have implications and lots of those hard surfaces, like I mentioned before. There also was a problem through these manipulations, the river became very flashy. Early 1900s, they did these large scale alterations, even downstream of that, to basically create a big flood conveyance stretch of river to where it's like those floods come up, they have a channelized stretch to where those waters will just flush out and leave the city of San Antonio, protect the infrastructure of the people. They had some devastating floods where, you had loss of a life and, lots of infrastructure. And so they made these large scale changes and, again, focusing on flood control, not thinking about maybe the ecological impacts to that. And even that strategy had its own problems. You flush water here, it's still going to somebody somewhere, right? And so there was some kind of re-engineering and thinking that needed to be done for that. And when they did that, it was called the San Antonio River Channel Improvements Project. And that in itself was to fix that flood conveyance problem, but also now let's include ecological integrity and trying to restore this area to make it better for all its users, humans or animals or whatever the case. And so, what we used to be a single, small, almost drainage ditch is now a large river with a large riparian area. We have lots of trees and native plants, and that helps out with a lot of the filtering out contaminants and all that kind of stuff, and a large kind of flood escapement area. And in the river itself, we have, in-stream structures like engineered riffles and, trying to create that riffle run pool sequence, which is good for, dissolved oxygen and for fish and habitat and all that. And so lots more complexity added to the river, which was great for fish and good for all the inhabitants there. And, that happened, that was completed in 2013. So we're, 10 plus years on from that. And, this is before my time at the agency, but, back around, 2014, there were some potential state listings of some mussel species. So our agency went into, and that was something that just wasn't really looked at, before that. And so our agency went in to kind of survey and get an idea of the mussel community in the San Antonio River, all the way from San Antonio downstream, to the Gulf, like I mentioned, and to look for those species. But also it just came as a kind of a revelation as to look at all these, mussel species that we do have in the river. Mussels are very, very important for freshwater ecosystems. When I say mussels, people probably think zebra mussels, right? Like that's people's heads.
That's the bad guy.
Those were bad. What do you mean? So the zebra mussels are very different. Those are from another continent. They're not something that we want. They're an invasive species, and they're different than our native freshwater mussels that live in our rivers and streams. And so just had to clarify that, just so nobody's
sure. Yeah.
But yeah, they're some of the greatest filtration systems that rivers can have, right? So they can filter pollutants and, affect the nutrients in the river and can do lots of really cool things. They create habitat. They're almost like, it's like having boulders or gravel or whatever in the stream, and they'll stabilize banks because they'll form these big, strong beds, right? Which kind of help with erosion. So do a lot of really cool stuff. And, those species that they were kind of looking for that were potential candidate, potential listed species, we didn't actually have in our system. But again, we saw the diversity that we had, and we started looking, and we weren't finding them in the upper San Antonio, and that's where that large scale mission reach restoration is. And it kind of came to question, like, were they here was one question, point in time. We found out that yes, they were. And then it got to, well, could we bring them back here? Could we bring mussels back along with all their ecosystem services to the mission reach to kind of take that restoration one step further and then to add to conservation. And so this project, it's our freshwater mussel reintroduction project. And we focusing on 4 species, work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Hatchery to propagate and raise these mussels. And if you didn't know, they have a really unique life history, because they need fish as part of being part of that, so that they actually will parasitize the gills of fish in their larval stages. And then once they'll calcify and they'll drop off, but they'll sit and filter on those gills until they're able to do that. It's their ability to move, right? I mean, mussels can't move much. And in the adult stage, they can scoot around a little bit, but they're not going to go long distances. So fish are their vessel to be able to go and do that. So really unique history. And when working with that hatchery, you know, we make sure that we have host fish for them to use. It's funny because there's all these kind of weird terms that sound bad, but they're actually good. So
right.
We say, you know, we had an infestation. Normally you'd be like, oh, that's a bad thing. That doesn't sound good. That actually means that they were putting, you know, the larval stage of the mussels onto fish gills. They were infesting the fish gills, right? So this is a good thing. You know, we're starting the process. And it's like, oh, we had this many drop-offs. It's like, oh, drop-offs, that's another negative word. No, it's actually a good thing. It means that mussels were able to go from their larval stage on the gills to be able to drop off as little mussels, you know? So kind of funny, those just little things like that. But we'll work with that hatchery, and it's funny because certain species of mussels we found work with certain fish as their host species. Otherwise, others just don't. And this is a known thing in that, you know, in the scientific world, but it took a lot of trial and error for us to kind of figure out which fish are going to work with the mussel we're trying to raise. And we now are working through that. And there's been a lot of feasibility studies, if you will, in the Mission Reach to say, you know, like, will they survive here? Will they grow here? Will they stay in place? And that's a really big one, because when flows get high, they need to be in areas that are more stable, where they're not just going to get blown downstream and rolled and tossed and likely not make it. So looking for those areas, there's been lots of really cool studies to kind of look at that, like, which includes, we have a lot of partners for this, some universities, and where they've actually 3D printed like exact replicas of our different species, and they're like adult and larval stages, and put them into the river with tags in them to where they could place them and then track
see where they can stay.
They move after different flow events and stuff. And this is all to feed, you know, where a mussel's gonna stay put. So 2024 was a big year. This project has been ongoing since about 2017, but 2019, I believe. 2024 was really the big success year, as we got over 3,500 mussels into the river. We got all 4 of our different species, and we put them in areas, you know, based on lots of those previous studies that I was mentioning, and so we'll see how they're doing. We're going to go check them out again. We tagged a large number of them as well, so we can go back and hopefully redetect them. And, you know, we'll use basically looks like a big minesweeper, metal detector type of thing. And basically they have little they call pit tags, passive integrated transponder tags that will glue on and stick to the shells.
Okay. I was about to ask, how do you tag them? How do you tag a mussel?
Yeah. There's lots of different ways. The pit tag is nice because you're able to more readily find them again, right? You don't have to just dig around blindly and search. It's maybe a little bit more systematic, using equipment to get a ping, and then you can start digging, right? So yeah, it's a really cool project, and we're excited. You know, we have a lot of support from the local area. It's also it's the first mussel reintroduction in the state of Texas, so pretty big. You know, I'd say I don't want to say groundbreaking. I'm not finding the right word here, but we're on the you know, innovative side, kind of pushing a lot of this. So it's really neat to be a part of that, and from the process of, you know, the fish and the mussels and the propagating, and to, you know, the study design of where we're putting them and how we're going to track them and monitor them. And definitely a really neat project. And, you know, the overall message is, you know, we're putting in mussels that will increase the health of the river by all the filtering that they do, and we're also contributing to just greater conservation. And because these mussels aren't on any sort of list, they're actually kind of relatively more common species. But really, it's about kind of bringing them back into a place that, you know, they should be, and then that can just contribute again to the further that restoration that we've done.
Sure.
Sorry,
well,
that was a long spiel. So
no, you're good. No, that's cool. I mean, it's the first mussel reintroduction program that I'm aware of. I don't know that Tennessee does one. I could be wrong, and maybe they do, but I know there's a lot of you know, anti-zebra mussel going on here. The whole entire Tennessee River, Mississippi River system, all the way up to the Great Lakes. I know it's a huge problem. I'm from Michigan originally, and they're up there too. And, you know, even from the fact that they're invasive and they're problematic, I mean, they are at least on the Tennessee River side of things, they're a very huge food source, and you can see a lot of different species that kind of, their population kind of survives around these mussel beds. And like you said, they move and they change due to flooding and whatnot. I imagine they work similarly, like you said, with the propagating on the gills and whatnot. I don't know for sure, but I do.
That's actually a really big difference between our native mussels and zebra mussels is they just need water. Basically, they just need their veligers or their larval stage. They don't need fish in that process. So that actually is an advantage for them, right? If they just need water to kind of broadcast, their larval stage and find somewhere to settle. It's a lot smarter than the way mussels do it.
Sure.
But, it's part of the reason why that they're such a problem, right? I mean, all you need to have is some standing water on your boat that has larval zebra mussels you don't know about, and you go from one water body to the next, and all of a sudden, we got a problem. And that's a big reason why they're spreading so much.
So for you boat owners out there, it's important to wash your boat.
Clean, drain, dry. You heard it here. Hopefully not the first time.
Right. But it's I know there's several species of freshwater mussels here, and like I said, I'm from Michigan, so I know they're there too. And I don't know to what extent they're. I know most of the ones in Tennessee, I'm under the impression are endangered. You're not allowed to use any of them for bait or anything like that here. I don't know if it's the same in Michigan. I know some places you can. I also know that for a lot of people that chase suckers, that the using clams to imitate those mussels is a pretty popular technique. And so it's interesting to really take that back that far and break it down into that small of a level, right? Everybody's like, oh, well, I want the largemouth bass to live. I want the trout to live. I want this stuff to live. Well, if you break it down, what they eat typically is going to be around the mussels and eating mussels and whatnot too. I mean, it's pretty crazy that it goes down, and it really is something that has that small of a building block to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, it just shows you how everything in a ecosystem is connected in some way. And, a lot of folks don't think about that or are not aware of it. A lot of folks are, and yeah, I mean, as an angler, you have to think about, what are the fish eating, and you're matching the hatch or whatever you're trying to do to, imitate a nice meal for them. And yeah, knowing a bit about what's in the water and what they could be going for could help.
Sure. I know I'm under the impression that the people that are watching and are listening are understanding what your opinion is of where the priority focus should be at this point between native and sport fishing. But do you want to go ahead and just explain a little more what your opinion is and
Sure.
why your opinion is that way?
Yeah. And I'm going to give a little more context to this too. And I'll back up a bit. And I mentioned I worked in Utah working with those really endemic, threatened or endangered fishes. One of the really interesting things about that job is, we were monitoring those fish. We were actively removing invasive species as well, invasive fishes. Of those, the majority of those were, priority sport fish in a lot of other areas. So like our number one that we removed was smallmouth bass, followed by northern pike, followed by walleye. So these were like really, and I wouldn't say that this was a very recreationally like targeted river for this. It was kind of like, this river system overall has reservoirs, fish get out, fish establish in rivers, and they are, they proliferate and they move and grow and they start impacting those native fish, whether that's through predation, competition, whatever the case may be. I mean, we'd find and catch walleye that have a tagged bony-tailed chub, in their bellies, because we'd run the scanner over them just to be sure, because we know they eat them, and sure enough, you'd find
Beep, beep.
Yeah, big old walleye with, a freshly, hatchery stocked bony-tailed chub, because it's an endangered fish. And so those are obviously direct impacts there. So that was, I would say, controversial to the locals if they were aware of it. We're killing the sport fish or removing the sport fish to save the trash fish, right? In a lot of their eyes. And it's a bigger thing in Colorado. It's in the same system, but Colorado people are a little bit more, there's just more people, and so there's more attention or uproar kind of on that, and that's a pretty interesting thing. And what was kind of funny is the following year, a lot of fisheries jobs are seasonal. So when I was a technician there at Utah and worked for a full kind of spring, summer, fall left, and then the next year I actually went up to Wyoming, but I was just on the other side of the Utah state line. And there I was working in a reservoir that fed that same river I worked in the previous year. And in the reservoir, I was managing the sport fish. I was managing the lake trout and the kokanee salmon and the smallmouth bass. And so kind of funny to do a kind of a 180 there. But, you know, again, you see there's value in both sides. For the purposes of biodiversity, you know, for ecosystem health and just in general, you know, conservation of native fishes is very, very important. And I think, you know, long term, that can have maybe more implications into what can happen to us on the, you know, whether it's in your body of water or, you know, scaling up to the planet. You know, biodiversity is very important. And when you are actively maybe working against that in some cases, it's, you know, difficult to kind of justify. But at the same time, you know, we've already made it to this point, right? There's no turning back the clock and changing what we've done, especially when it comes to large reservoirs. You know, those reservoirs are usually done for, again, some sort of flood control or hydropower or irrigation, so water storage. So like that in itself, we're not going to be able to, you know, we can't just take out all the dams, right? That's going to have, right. It's not realistic. So I think doing the best with what we can. I mean, those reservoirs, and then a lot of them have a lot of economic value for a lot of the fishes inside of them, whether they're native or not. So I think it's kind of you know, taking the best of both worlds if we can, you know, in the reservoirs, if we need to focus on this fish because of the economic value it brings to, you know, to the field or to this town or whatever the case is. You know, I see value in that, but at the same time doing what we can to mitigate impacts and, you know, areas downstream of that dam or in the rivers. And I think it's a tricky thing because a lot of the times it's the habitat that's the problem. It's the damming itself. It's the alteration of this river because of, you know, whatever the case, like the chub, right? They can't reproduce now because they don't have a long enough river distance now, you know, to do that. And so a lot of it's habitat. You know, you lose any kind of floodplain habitat that's important for some fish's life histories. And so we're working, you know, in areas to kind of create that if they can, or to mitigate that. But a lot of times it's the habitat. It's not necessarily the fish. The fish are a factor, but, you know, the underlying issue a lot of times is habitat. And so maybe, you know, focusing on what, you know, not tipping the scale even further, right? And trying to be in a place where we can kind of balance things the best we can, you know. And I know that's kind of a broad, you know, I'm not picking a side type of stance, but I think
I'm with you, man. There's you and I are in the same spot. I mean, there's definitely something to be said for both. You got to have funding, and obviously the easiest way to get funding in this scenario is to feed the sport fishing side of it, right? So, I mean, like you said, it's a necessary evil, if you will. But it definitely has its part. And like you said, there's certain points at the dams and the reservoirs and one, like you said, you can't go back. Those are turned into a necessity, and it's not something we can get rid of. And with that being said, there's something to be said for the phrase survival of the fittest, right? So there's going to be unfortunately, some species that either are never going to come back or are going to have a hard time coming back because of that process. But I mean, that's the unfortunate part of not thinking about all this stuff way back when. You know, what was there a better option than damming the river for the hydroelectric power? I don't know. That's definitely not anything I've ever really thought about, especially not as a fisherman. But I mean, you know, like if I didn't think about it now, knowing what I know, why would they have thought about it then either? You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm with you. There's certain things that we're way out of our, not say jurisdiction, way out of our control rather. But I do agree that it's important to at least take a look at it for sure. And do I think personally that sport fishing species shouldn't be stocked? I think any fish transplanting into something else is bad. But I mean, at the same time, there's been certain cases where it's actually been a benefit. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I know I've read some of these studies where like this whole entire basin was basically dead already kind of thing, but then they brought this fish in, which because of that brought another fish in, and then it can kind of stabilize and whatnot. So I mean, it can have some positives, for sure. But even if it's just at the point of funding for the other projects and whatnot, I think overall it's definitely it's going to be a battle. It's going to be a struggle. And there's obviously people that are hardcore both sides, right? So there's always going to be those debates for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think they're both necessary.
Yeah, and as far as, in an ecosystem, that certain species are going to serve certain functions, and maybe one has been here for a very, very long time, but then another one gets introduced into that area and is, kind of filling in that same niche, and maybe it's contributing the same kind of, again, function to the system. So it's hard to, but at the same time, that if that happens, it continues to happen, and that's a sliding scale, to greatly reduce biodiversity overall. I mean, freshwater fishes, 40% of North America freshwater fishes are considered as imperiled, so freshwater fishes in general represent 25% of the world's vertebrate diversity, right? So it's it's a thing to think about. It's something that folks don't necessarily, outside of anglers and people in the scientific field, are thinking much at all about. And that's a whole nother ball game, right? But yeah, we don't even need to go into that. But you mentioned the funding, and that's an interesting thing to me too, because that's kind of what's laid the foundation for a lot of this stuff. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Dingell-Johnson Act, but basically,
I am not.
That act, it's also called the Sport Fish Restoration Act. It's got a funny name, Dingell-Johnson.
Okay. Yeah.
It basically funded, put an excise tax or federal tax on fishing gear, which can then be spent on sport fish management or habitat improvements. But again, exclusively for sport fish. And this is back in 1950, so that was kind of the thing there. And again, recreational anglers are targeting sport fish, so put two and two together, it makes sense, right? But that's still a thing. It's similar to the Pittman-Robertson. That's kind of the wildlife version of that bill, kind of around the same time, I think. And that's a lot of ways in the same thing, but that's on all gun sales. There's an excise tax on every gun that's sold that goes towards kind of wildlife management, and usually kind of those hunter targeted or harvested species. And so interesting thing that laid the foundation for a lot of maybe dollars going towards sport fish, right? And there's just really not that infrastructure for native fishes. There's back in 2000, they passed the state wildlife grant, kind of SWA, agencies will write up their swaps. And that's what I mentioned before about the species of greatest conservation need. That's kind of the lingo going towards those state wildlife grants. And that's what funds a lot of native, maybe non-sport fish research or things of that nature. But that pot's a lot smaller. And usually that's coming from, I can't remember the exact structure of it, but I know it's I think licensed sales in a state thrown into a pot, and then it goes to the feds and gets redistributed somehow. And there's a whole formula that goes into some of that. But I'd say the larger portion of dollars is coming in towards sport fish. And yeah, there was some headway, I don't know, maybe 2-3 years ago and beyond that, for something called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. And that was a cool one that, because obviously we have endangered species funding, and then we have a lot of funding for sport fish, right, or recreational targeted fish. But then that in the middle, if you weren't endangered and you weren't a sport fish, how are you going to get anything? And again, some of that was state wildlife grants, but they were trying to create a lot more dollars to go towards those kinds of groups, that kind of middle of the road group. And there was, there's a lot of headway on it. There's a lot of bipartisan support, but it just never actually made it through. And I'm not sure what its current status is now, but that was something that was promising. And it wasn't just fish. It was, all animals, and because we see kind of the same thing in the hunting and the wildlife world.
Sure. Yeah.
So, a lot of it, it's the, it's just kind of those are the kind of the milestones or the foundations that kind of maybe led us down some of this path. Right. But yeah, so, you want to understand something, look at the money.
Sure. Yeah. And then that definitely shows where the majority of the priority, I guess, like you said, is definitely leaning towards the sport fishing side of things. With that being,
I do want to mention there's times where, we're talking about these conflicts and stuff, but there's obvious times where there's a sport fish that's also a native fish that people want to conserve. Like, for instance, salmon up in the Pacific Northwest. Like, that's a big one. And when you hit both of those, like, that fish is going to be good for a while.
Cha-ching. Yep, exactly.
They're knocking down dams for salmon.
Right. Well, and, actually, speaking of that, there's some of the other big area ones. There was a couple specifically that were introduced that were kind of an issue and could be an issue. Where did it go? Western U.S., the native cutthroat trout versus the stock rainbow brook trout. That was being an issue at one point. The Florida largemouth bass versus the native sunfish and shad. Mostly for that one, it was talking about like you said, not everything's about the fish, right? It was the vegetation management that was having the negative impact on the native species there. Then Lake Michigan stocking the non-native salmon, how it was wiping out some of the lake trout in the Cisco because they were putting it there to deal with the invasive alewives, which I was born in Michigan. I'm 30-something years old now. Until today, I did not know that alewives were actually invasive. So, I mean, like, I just thought that was just a very prolific fish. I didn't realize it was a problem, and that's why they got salmon put in there. I never realized that. I just thought, naturally occurred.
Yeah.
It's crazy. It's crazy how much people don't know until they look into it, and it's all right there for you. I mean, it's very easy to find.
Especially in today's world, it's at the tip of your fingertips, right?
Sure.
Any question you have, just throw it into Google or now all these AI platforms and spit it out.
Yeah, it's got positive and negatives too, right? It's a whole nother discussion, really. But then of course there's always gonna be some bad information out there. It's like, again, with the whole, Grandpa said that this was that a bowfin was a snakehead, or Grandpa said that I shouldn't eat this fish because it tastes like cardboard or whatever, right? That kind of stuff. It's not necessarily. I'm not saying everything's Grandpa's fault, obviously, but those are just the common ones I hear, right?
Yeah. There's a culture though, right? And there's a kind
of
things, fishing itself and Grandpa. I mean, that's how a lot of things gets passed down within families, and fishing is usually a lot of times a family tradition that you learn from growing up or whatever. And yeah, a lot of those kind of ideas or thoughts get passed down, whether they're true or not,
Sure. Now, speaking of that, so obviously one of the big ones being the bowfin snakehead one being the one that stuck out just a second ago, but like, in your experience as a fish in fisheries management, how important is species identification?
Very much so. Yeah, I mean, it's the baseline for what we do, and that's very important for obviously for our jobs. We're the professionals, right? Like we're trained to do that. I'd say if you're an angler and you're going to, whether you're in an unfamiliar place or you're not sure about IDs, it's definitely important. That's a great example. Non-native or fishes that you shouldn't put back in the water may look like one that you should, and so knowing maybe what's in the water body you're going for will definitely help you.
It was actually funny you were talking about the earlier. I mean, this is going way back to the beginning of the conversation, but you're talking about the Guadalupe Bass hybridizing with the smallmouth.
Yeah.
We actually have a similar problem here, but it's the smallmouth that are hybridizing with the Alabama spotted bass.
Mm-hmm.
To the point where like they're debating changing regulations. Like it was, I think you could keep 5 black bass a day, which they classify as just spotted largemouth and smallmouth for that creel limit.
Yeah.
Obviously, we have a couple other little ones here, red eye and a couple other ones, the Coosa bass and something else. But again, not in that category for that regulation. But you could only keep the smallmouth bass. You could keep 2, I think, out of the 5, and they had to be at least 18 inches long.
Yeah.
Well, now they're changing it where if you can have as many out of well, I don't know if it's 100% going to get passed or not, but one of the proposed changes is to make it so that out of the 5, you can have as many smallmouth bass you want as long as they're under 16 inches. Trying to weed those out, and it's crazy to see that big of a shift because it's been the other way for decades, and it's crazy how in that regard is detrimental, right? But in terms of because smallmouth are native here, whereas the Alabama spotted bass is not, and it's just crazy how much of an impact that fish has. Even if it's not, one of the biggest, shifting over to Asian carp, one of the biggest concerns there is that they just eat everything, right? And then breed really fast. Yeah. Whereas this one, it's not so much that they eat everything. They're not competing for the food. They're literally just competing for the genes, if you will, right? It's just like, it's just different how different things can affect things at such weird levels, really, if you think about it. I mean,
yeah.
Some of it makes sense more than others.
Muddies the waters, right?
Exactly.
There, but yeah. It can get messy.
Sure, and like you said, that's just, we obviously as a society moved those fish for the albino spotted bass to get moved, but that's a natural way of the biodiversity getting changed in a negative way. Because obviously, if they all hybridized, then there would be no more pure smallmouth bass anymore. And I agree with you 100% that I think that there's a reason that the biodiversity is there. That if we did have everything is the same, everything, well, there's something that got missed or isn't getting, like you said, not a niche, a role that isn't filled anymore. What that role is, we may or never know, but I definitely think that this, definitely think that needs to be thought about and is a concern for sure. And in your experience, you didn't say for sure how long you were. I don't remember you saying how long you were with the San Antonio River Authority. But what is something with you working for them as long as you have at this point? What is something that you've noticed maybe that you think they're maybe lacking in? Is there something, an area that you think that you wish they would try harder on, or is there a certain project you wish they would maybe look at that hasn't happened yet?
Yeah, that's a tough question.
Sure. I mean, if you can't answer, you can't answer. I understand. I don't want to emphasize.
No. Yeah, I mean, I think there's, as far as the mussel project, for instance, the reintroduction project, us getting support on that from our leadership and stuff was pretty big. We're not necessarily so I'm in the environmental sciences department. We're not necessarily just a conservation organization. Again, we operate a lot of the engineered aspects of the river. We have wastewater treatment plants, right? And then we have us who are monitoring ecological health. So for us to get the support for a larger kind of environmental project was huge, and would love to see more of that. I think there's always things that we could look at more. Sometimes it just comes down to timing or funding or whatever the case may be, and having staff availability or this or that, or different priorities. So I think it's, we're always looking for new ways, new projects and things that we can look at, whether that's, blending some of the other sections like the engineers and our parks department or whatever the case, having that kind of multi-level stacked benefits sort of thing is always good. One example of that is a lake that we're going to have open to the public. I think I mentioned that earlier, and we're wanting to manage that as a recreational fishery, so we want to have people can come out, but we're not going to dive into this is going to be all trophy bass. First of all, that takes a lot of management to get there, and it's a smaller lake, but at the same time, we want a family to come out and catch a catfish or whatever the case is.
Have a good time. Yep.
So we want to be sure that, and we want somebody to come out who wants to, bird watch, or just enjoy the atmosphere or the nature of the lake. And so just having those multi-level benefits is things that we're looking for, and it helps us kind of add things to that. Another good example of that is, we had a dam in the lower San Antonio that basically is old and failing and doesn't really serve a lot of purpose. And we got some funding for the National Fish Passage Program to basically rehab that dam, make it more fish friendly, to allow for the passage of things like the American eel, right? Who makes long migrations from saltwater to freshwater. And so it's, I think we're on the forefront of a lot of cool stuff, and kind of just making sure we're keeping up with the times and keep pushing that, and, bringing those opportunities to, folks in the agency. So I think we're doing a good job of that, and just kind of continuing that. There's not one thing that I'm like, I wish they would do this, but I think, 'cause I think we're doing a lot to, for the agency and for the overall health of the basin, of the river, of the watershed.
Yeah, sounds like it, man. That's cool. With that being said, also, you talk about the Guadalupe Bass being the second biggest prize, the mussel one being the big one for 2024. Overall, the Guadalupe getting reintroduced in San Antonio being one of the other ones that they've been really very successful with. Let me rephrase. Has there been a shift? Is there any native fish that are now considered more of a sport fish because of those projects in particular? I mean, I'm not saying Guadalupe doesn't get huge, so I'm assuming maybe that one's not considered mainstream sport fish yet, but is there anything that you've been working with or heard or has been worked with the agency at least that has shifted that? like shifted the opinion of the public on those fish?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the Guadalupe bass, I would say, is actually a good one because we'll have actually fly fishermen that'll target them as well because they'll kind of sit in spots that maybe a trout would, and so you can, obviously you're using different tactics and stuff to catch them on the fly, but I'd say they're one that's, targeted recreationally. I know I think there are some guides in the lower San Antonio that are going for big gar, and that would definitely be one of those, people targeting or trying to catch those. You always have kind of carp anglers wherever you go and suckers and stuff, and haven't heard a lot on that, but I'm sure they're there. It's a big river and long, lots of people in the downstream counties that are probably just throwing a line out trying to, get a bite and catch something. So
sure. You were also talking about the restoration project where you're doing the whole riffle hole run concept. Can you maybe kind of explain, obviously the thought process is to increase the oxygen and the overall health of the river, but where did that idea come from, I guess I should say? Because like you said, it was just a drain ditch, and then, they made it basically a bigger concrete drain ditch, and now they're adding stuff. What sparked that?
Yeah, I mean, the big idea, I think, was just more habitat complexity. Different fish are going to sit in different habitats. You have riffle small body species maybe sitting in that shallow, fast water over the different, gravel and boulders and stuff, and versus, different fish out in deeper water, slower water. So the more complexity and different habitats you have, the more room you have for more species to exist, and really it's just to emulate more of that, what you would see in a natural river, right? I mean, you go out to a small stream or river, you'll often get that progression of riffles, runs, pools, and it kind of repeats. And so the idea was, I think that was kind of the big thing, and something that they added to those riffle structures. It actually made the whole stretch basically a paddling trail as well. So to these riffle structures, they had these little kayak chutes, is what they call them, and basically a big little, looks like a little water conveyor belt in a little chute to go down and connects the whole Mission Reach to where people can come in and kayak, and we'll hold races and stuff in there. And, it's a lot of fun for the public. So there's a really, really big, recreational aspect that I didn't exactly touch on, but that's definitely a big part of it as well.
Sure. Is there anything else that you want to add that maybe we didn't cover in terms of what you do with the agency that maybe you think needs to be brought out?
No, I think we covered pretty good with the agency. I will say, kind of going back to the larger topic of native fish, sport fish, all that stuff. A lot of it is, we said the foundation of how things were funded, and a lot of it's, how they're also classified by state agencies or viewed by the public. And really that classification, you look up, which you looked up Tennessee game fish, they would have a list of fishes on there. And then there'd be a lot that people wouldn't even know about or would know about, and they'd be less desirable or whatever the case is. And a lot of these fish in that area don't have protections along them because they don't have a classification, right? They're just kind of other fish. There's no regulations on them. Now, you see this a lot in the bow fishing industry where they'll go out and maybe they'll shoot a bunch of Asian carp or common carp or, a lot of invasive species, but then they're also shooting the buffalo and shooting our large suckers. And again, those are long-lived, important species. And so I think, agencies, having a push to have agencies actually classify these fish, give them some sort of regulation or protection would be a beneficial thing to kind of, lift up those other areas that have been, left out, I guess, for so long. And I think actually saw that Minnesota recently passed a bill that did this, and they made them basically classified them as, I think it was native rough fish or something like that, which, gave them a classification and gave them some protections on top of that. So I think it's possible. And I think people would be, people are obviously resistant to change and whatnot, but, so you get to shoot less buffalo, or you get to, bank less gar, but like at the end of the day, like it's doing more for, the health of the river, also the image of anglers. And, if you're, again, I think hunting and fishing, conservation, all those things are tied together, right? Because a lot of times one feeds the other and whatnot. And, understanding that and understanding that there are people outside of those areas, somebody in a city or somebody who's, doesn't get outside a lot, and they're not gonna care about the resources that we care about. And so you may even have opinions or ideas about things that they don't have the knowledge base to really, they're just in a good way to put it, they're just uninformed in a lot of areas, right? And they see somebody maybe killing a fish for no reason, or, whatever the case is, that they see an image that doesn't look good. That doesn't look good for our community, overall, that, should be thinking about things like conservation, thinking about fish communities, and, being ethical and responsible and all that kind of stuff. So I think, projecting a good image to the non, hunting, fishing public, who, and some of them maybe, they don't want to get into the ones that would like to see both of those things go away,
Sure. Yeah.
But the folks that maybe don't have a lot of information on, projecting a good image and showing that, like, oh yeah, I catch fish or I hunt, but, did you know that these things are funding fish and wildlife conservation throughout the nation, or did you know that I bow fish, but, I'm shooting the fish that are invasive that shouldn't be here, or whatever. And so it's just having a way to, again, project a good image. So to protect things that...
Well, and like you, Ron, even like you said, the people that may see those activities, even if they're ones that wish they would both go away, that could be ones that are potentially wanting to fund the native species or the habitat rehabilitation projects. Man, I'm tongue twisters today. Yeah. But the... it's something, again, we don't think about. I've been raised personally to not kill anything I'm not going to eat, and that's just always stuck with me. So it's never been a problem for me. If I ever did decide to go bow fishing, I would keep I would eat what I shot. But obviously, I'd be a little more picky. I mean, I'm not. You don't go out when you're deer hunting and shooting every single one you see. Obviously, you can't illegally anyway. But just saying, you wouldn't want to, because there's certain points where it's like, why did I shoot that one? Or why would I shoot that one? And it's just like, did I shoot it because of the rack? Did I shoot it because I wanted a lot of meat? Stuff like that. There should be a reason for everything you do. And no matter what you do, even if you don't have a reason, there's going to be a consequence, and you got to be able to deal with that consequence.
Yeah,
for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel the same way, and I think, again, people just don't realize that a lot of times that is happening. You have responsible, ethical folks who, even want to go down rabbit holes of mountain lion hunters and, people hunting bears and stuff. And it's like, people don't realize that most people are eating that meat, and whether the pursuit of it is for that or for a mix of that, and, a long history inside of a family or whatever the case is, it's, the folks doing that responsibly, it's a bummer to see those things, get targeted or get taken away because of some folks who do it irresponsibly, and
one bad apple ruins the bushel.
Exactly.
All right. Well, is there anything else you want to add out there for anybody who's maybe wanting to if they want to get more information from maybe their own state legislation, or not legislation, but state agencies, whatever? Is there a certain route? I don't know how Texas is set up. Is there a certain route that maybe is considered normal to be able to go up the chain to be able to talk to people about stuff or to get more information?
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably your local fisheries biologists or managers. Probably most states have it where that's listed publicly, to where you could maybe talk to them or better understand and see where you could voice an opinion or try to be part of that, or get some recommendations from them on some things. So yeah, I know Texas has that, where Texas Parks and Wildlife has a lot of that information public. You can look up, the San Antonio district office or whatever the case, and you can reach out to those folks.
Sure. And, well, with that being said, I appreciate you coming up and joining me today. For those who didn't catch the beginning of this, you somehow tuned in the middle of it. This is Mitch from the San Antonio River Authority. He's been talking to us about fisheries management as a whole, specifically influenced by his projects in Texas and a couple of his projects in the past from his travels. We do appreciate you coming on and talking to us about aquatic biology and how it affects everything and not just fisheries, or it affects fisheries by not just fish, how it affects everything else. And again, a lot of good information. I really appreciate it. And again, thank you, sir. I really appreciate you coming on. Thanks for reaching out to me on Facebook about this. And again, I hope you have a good night, and thank you very much.
Yeah. Same here. It's a pleasure to be on. It's fun to chat about some of this. So appreciate you having a platform to do this, and maybe spread the message to some other folks.
Well, like you said, it's not necessarily misinformation is out there, obviously, but it's more of a lack of information. If people don't know it exists or it doesn't know it's a thing, I mean, how are they going to know? Yeah. So it's kind of the goal here.
Yeah, absolutely. And fish, they aren't like birds. You can't just see them in trees. Some of these fish you never know would exist that are in your local river or stream. So
exactly,
it's a harder one to get people to maybe realize if they can't catch one hook and line, per se. So.
Sure. Well, y'all, thanks for tuning into the Bait Tank tonight. Again, we had Mitch with us talking about the aquatic diversity and his biological studies on it and what the San Antonio River Authority is doing down there in Texas. If you guys do want to contribute more to the show, you can always check us out on Patreon. If you have any questions or concerns, you can always email us at thebaittank@yahoo.com. Again, my name is Anthony. Hope you all have a good night, and we'll see y'all next time on the Bait Tank. And remember, if it's fishing, we'll talk about it.